Well, hello, welcome. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, official beta of ungrateful colonials to the Court of St. James, master of some quite specific knotwork and purveyor of history on the internet, which means today we will be continuing a series about the forgotten war in the Second World War, that is, the fight around Burma, China and India. So for those of you who perhaps haven't been here before and lack the basics like a yellowing skin or your first dose of cerebral malaria, this might not be the ideal place for you to begin, but have no fear, my friends, because you only need to go back one episode to pick things up and to grab a hold of the key and relevant information, and you will see on screen now a clever white little wee doohickey at the top, which if you click will take you back to that very episode and you can begin your ascent of the chocolate staircase in perfect safety. Or, of course, you may wish to ignore me entirely and crack on here working out what's going on for yourself. Without a court order enforcing a DNA test, I can't prove that I'm your father, so you can do as you please. For those sporting their bush hats, Mark IV Lee Enfields and strange itches in the crotch area, a quick recap. Last time we looked at Mutaguchi Reina's plan to invade India using the 28th and 15th Japanese armies. Much like my approach to making love, Mutaguchi planned to come over the hills in 3 or 4 thrusts. In the south, he launched a feint with 25,000 men of Yanagida's Mozotu's 33rd Division at Tidim and Tamu, designed to draw reinforcements out of Imphal, before the main attacks would come crashing across the hills into Imphal and Kohima by Yamaguchi Musafumu and Satu Kotoku, with about 20,000 men each in the 15th and 31st Japanese divisions, plus about another 50,000 support troops and 6,000 men of the Indian National Army on hand to plug gaps where needed. But what he hadn't banked on was Uncle Bill's counterplan, that is, to immediately withdraw 17th and 20th Indian Divisions back from Tidim and Tamu the moment that the Japanese turned up, luring them into a trap on the Imphal plains. There, the British and Indian forces could concentrate around key airfields, bringing their superior firepower, logistics and armour together to destroy the Japanese forces, who in turn would be massively overstretched and unable to resupply themselves. And whilst that all sounds terribly clever, what Uncle Bill hadn't quite clocked was just how powerful the Japanese thrusts across the Naga Hills would prove to be. Thus, both sides were doing not quite what the other one thought, and today we will turn our attention to what actually happened when the shooting started. 17th Indian Division, now based around Tidim, was the oldest division in 14th Army and had the distinction of having been in combat every single day since the Japanese first turned up in Burma back in December of 1941. Commanded by the superb Major General Punch Cowan, known as the Black Cats, 17th Indian had been transformed by Cowan from a colonial gendarmerie into a modern fighting force in a little over 14 months, and in the first part of 1944 was engaged in merrily kicking the living snot out of any Japanese patrols in the Chin Hills. To conform to Slim's plan for retreating to Tidim, Cowan and the 17th needed to do a few things at once. Firstly, he needed to avoid direct engagement with the main body of the Japanese troops, as retreat in contact is bloody difficult. Secondly, critically, he needed to avoid encirclement, so he needed to get his timing exactly right and get that retreat to Imphal done at the right moment and quickly. But conversely, he needed to do it in a way which was sort of the military equivalent of looking over his shoulder and going, chase me, boys," to the Japanese to keep them keen enough that they would continue their pursuit. To that end, Slim had decided that the best thing to do was to leave the timing of this withdrawal in the hands of Cowan's boss, 4th Corps Commander Geoffrey Scoones. Now, on paper, this is a brilliant idea. It gave local autonomy to local commanders, and it didn't dictate from above, and generally speaking, that is a sensible move. But in practice here, there were a couple of issues. Firstly was that Scoones was, how to put this nicely, well, look, he wasn't overly blessed with brains, and he wasn't one of the world's greatest communicators. Secondly, the nature of 14th Army intelligence was that it was, well, naturally highly secret. It was actually coming from decrypts done by the Indian branches of Bletchley Park. So telling anybody exactly where that information came from was quite tricky. They'd come up with a date, which was the 15th of March, so Scoones knew that there was a date in mind, the 15th of March, but what he didn't know was where that had actually come from. And nor could he see the mounting picture of Japanese movements across Assam and Manipur in the way that Slim and his headquarters in Kumilla could. In hindsight then, the timing was probably best dictated from above, and the upshot of all of this was that when on the 7th of March, a full week earlier than expected, there were reports of Japanese troops moving to cut the Tidim-Imphal road, Scoones dithered. General Yanagida's 33rd Division cut that road behind 17th Division 48 hours later, bisecting British forces and cutting Imphal off from the reinforcements that it had been expecting to use to defend itself with, and this could have spelt disaster for both forces around Tidim and those in Kohima and Imphal. But fortunately, Cowan's proactive defence included aggressive patrolling of potential Japanese routes of advance, and as a result, as early as the 8th of March, his scouts were already watching the Japanese moving through his positions. Commanders do not like, as a rule, issuing orders to retreat, and they like it even less when subordinates peremptorily just abandon their positions without permission. That sort of thing tends to lead to, final cigarettes and walls and stuff. Cowan, not having heard from Scoons, despite actively seeking orders from above, began to prepare to move anyway. He started by sending his sick and wounded north to Imphal just as quick as he could, along with any stores that he could move, and they snuck through just in time, just as the Japanese began to erect various strong roadblocks in the way. Unfortunately, Scoons refused to believe the reports reaching him and issued no new orders. Cowan decided on the 13th of March to take matters into his own hands and move anyway. Just at that moment, Scoons woke up to the danger, so fortunately everybody was on the same page as Cowan began to move. Scoons did exactly what the Japanese wanted him to at this point by committing his only infantry reserves, 2 brigades from 23rd Division based at Imphal, to go south to help dig Cowan out of the hole that he'd created. In point of fact, Cowan conducted a textbook withdrawal in contact and began to go about the methodical and complete destruction of any Japanese units in his path, whilst merrily sowing mines and booby traps behind him with gay abandon. To speed his movement, he destroyed what stores he couldn't move, leaving nothing behind for the Japanese to capture, and instead relied on air supply to keep his troops fed, watered and with ammunition to fight, an option which hadn't even occurred to the Japanese as being a possibility for the British because it was so far outside their own capabilities. In fact, if we switch our view over to General Yanagida and the 33rd Division, we can see that he was not even at this early stage having the best of times. Although he had actually crossed the Chinduin early and managed to dig in several units across the Tidim-Imphal road quicker than he thought he would, basically everything else that he did went wrong almost immediately. Firstly, the British were not panicking. It was clear that they were still holding formations together and they were moving cohesively in a way that was entirely unexpected by Mutaguchi. Secondly, the entire movement to get 33rd Division in place had turned into a bloody nightmare of RAF attacks coming from the air, dying cattle, which was supposed to be the supplies that they would have with them on the hoof, and then the lack of general supplies which had been promised. Something like 250 tons had been promised and never showed up, and then entire units that were supposed to compose part of 33rd Division got lost and just never showed up at all, meaning that the division moved off incomplete. Japanese communications had broken down almost completely once on the move, so Yanagida really didn't have any idea where half of his units were at any moment in time, and it wasn't until the 23rd of March, a full 10 days after Cowan had left Tidim, that the Japanese realised that there was no one left in the town. Things began to look up a little bit for 33rd Division when their 3rd Battalion of the 215th Regiment managed to capture a vast supply dump at milestone 109, but that didn't go so well for them. 3rd Battalion dug in as per the textbook, creating their classic roadblock and bunker system, which should have stopped anything that the British wanted to do. In fact, historically, it had always done it, and invited the British to come to them. Now, in the past, what would have happened is the British Army would have moved in, they would have stood there for a bit, sucked through their teeth, bombarded it with artillery for a while, stopped, given it a good 10-15 minutes to allow the Japanese to get back into place, and then sent a World War I-style infantry attack in, which would be mown down by machine guns, as had happened repeatedly during the first Arakan campaign. Instead, the British and Indian forces executed a series of devastating combined arms attacks from both north and south of the Japanese positions. Stuart light tanks of the 7th Cavalry combined with artillery and infantry to suppress and swamp Japanese positions, with the much unloved Vengeance dive bombers attacking from the air. The use of armour here really heralded the future. They would get close enough using their 37mm guns to be able to pump shells right flat into the Japanese bunkers, over the heads of advancing troops who would crawl forward to a point when they could throw grenades and then perform a last-minute dash to rush to take the positions hand to hand. 3rd Battalion 215th held the supply depot for a little over 72 hours before being routed. The message that got to Yanagida was very garbled and entirely shocking. What he heard was not just had 3rd Battalion been wiped out, but actually the entire 215th Regiment had been destroyed, and on top of that, 214th Regiment, which had been supposed to be striking further up the road, had been stopped dead. So as far as he was concerned, his key troop concentrations had either been killed or not in place, and he had no supplies to speak of, and his troops were already beginning to die of malnutrition and disease at a worrying rate. Messages from 15th Army HQ did not fucking help, as Mutaguchi sent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individual communications, each demanding updates and more action, and told Yanagida to move in this direction and that direction and close with the enemy and get up to Imphal and take it within 3 weeks, and on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And this wasn't really very bloody easy. They were, in fact, as Yanagida only now knew too well, two entire, intact Indian divisions in his way, both of whom were fighting incredibly well. And this slowdown in the schedule meant that he was now facing an absolute certainty of failure in his supply. Yanagida had nursed a burning hatred for Mutaguchi for decades, going back to the days when Yanagida had been part of the so-called Toshehai, or control faction of the army. This was a group of officers who in the late 1920s and early 1930s had argued that Japan should stop all this stuff about Bushido and pretending to be samurai and actually, become a modern country. Against them were the Kudohai, or the Imperial Way faction, who argued for a totalitarian military dictatorship based on Bushido, with the emperor at the heart of it, and an aggressive expansion of the empire. And guess who was a member of the Imperial Way? Yep, his boss, Mutaguchi Reina, whose idea all of this plan had been. This was too much for Yanagida. He now sent one of the most extraordinary messages any commander ever composed in the Second World War. The combat situation of 214 Regiment is not developing satisfactorily, and discouraging reports are coming from 215 Regiment. The capture of Imphal within 3 weeks is now impossible. The wet weather and lack of supplies will lead only to disaster. The strategic importance of Imphal has in any case been exaggerated. Accordingly, the 33rd Division is unable to comply with any orders from the 15th Army. I suggest you give alternative orders so that some failure does not occur elsewhere. Or if I can paraphrase, what the fuck are you playing at, you moron? And he then proceeded to move at the most leisurely pace he could imagine towards Imphal. Now, Mutaguchi reacted as if he'd been given a sriracha sauce enema. Everything relied on speed of action from the commanders on the ground, and now this blockhead was telling him that the plan had failed before it had really even started. The problem was that he was way back in Burma, and there wasn't a whole lot that he could do directly unless he got on a plane and moved much closer, which naturally he didn't want to do. Fortunately, at least from Mutaguchi's perspective, not everyone on 33rd Division staff shared Yanagida's pessimistic view, including his own Chief of Staff, Colonel Tanaka, the net result of which was Mutaguchi would then move to try and direct 33rd Division's efforts, bypassing its CO entirely and giving orders solely to Tanaka. This is not how one is supposed to manage an army in the field, especially not one engaged in a high-stakes fight like this. All this farting about and Japanese descending into infighting gave 17th Indian Division the room that they needed to conduct an orderly withdrawal to Imphal. Cowan pulled all of his forces through 3 attempted roadblocks and backed to positions near Bashanpur by the 5th of April, and along the way he curb-stomped 2nd Battalion 213 Regiment, who had actually been the very troops that had stopped the entire British and Indian force in the Arakan the previous year. Despite having flirted with disaster, Scoones' decision to move reinforcements down to go and help Cowan, Cowan's own disciplined handling of his division, and of course the brilliance of the troops on the ground themselves meant that in all some 16,000 troops, 2,500 vehicles and 3,500 mules had been pulled out at the cost of 1,200 casualties, whilst inflicting 2 or 3 times that many on the enemy. It was in fact a magnificent feat of arms, given how badly wrong it could have gone, and in the process the reserves which had been committed were restored to Scoones, which is just as well, because he was going to need them. The fight around Imphal was far from over. As we discussed last episode, the other half of Slim's withdrawal plan was Robert Gracey's 20th Indian Division, covering a vast area of potential Japanese advance around Tamu and down to the Chindwin River. Problem was that, as I mentioned a minute ago, Scoones wasn't one of life's great communicators. He told Gracey that what he should do is, on the issuing of a code word, Wellington, he should form into defensive boxes around a village called Moray, and do basically what the 7th Division had done down at the admin box, preparing to hold out against the Japanese and any advance that they made. Scoones assumed, as we said last time, that the Japanese would use the road, and thus, if 20th could sit at the head of that road, they'd effectively stop the Japanese advance dead. Gracey had, therefore, prepared significant dumps of ammo, he'd laid minefields, dug positions, and generally got ready to fight a siege around Moray, which is not unreasonable, and he was confident that he could hold no matter what happened. On the 13th of March, Major General Yamamoto's strike force of 4 battalions appeared, conducting mass charges at the British positions at a place called Wittock. This did not go well for them. Gracey's carefully built defensive position, developed over several months and updated based on learning which came out of the Arakan, saw the use of, for example, 3rd Carabiniers M3 tanks, a pre-sighted artillery plan and a pre-sighted air support plan used to smash up Japanese concentrations and block their attempted movement toward Tamu. However, As it became clear that there were at least 45,000 Japanese in the area, threatening to go round and attack Imphal and Kohima from the side, as well as Tidham, Scoones was beginning to get worried that 20th Division would be totally cut off, and realised belatedly that the Japanese could simply go round the British. They had no need of that bloody road. Which, to be honest, I'm pretty surprised he hadn't figured out before, certainly hadn't articulated before, as anybody with a cursory knowledge of the Japanese at this point should have done. Somewhat inexplicably, Scoones had never actually told Gracey that he had a plan B in mind if he thought this was going to happen, and on the 26th of March, completely out of the blue as far as Gracey was concerned, an order came through from Scoones at 4th Corps headquarters Imphal to take up positions at Shenham and Palal. This did not go over well with Gracey, nor indeed with his troops, who protested vehemently that they were winning the fight handily where they were. Nonetheless, with bad grace, I suppose, Gracey moved, and probably just in time. As all of this was going on in the south, in the north the hills began to swarm with advancing Japanese. Having crossed the Chindwin at the start of March, the two northern Japanese thrusts under Yamauchi and Sato were close to completing their epic 100-plus mile marches through the jungles and hills of the Naga Range to close with their enemy. It was an incredibly impressive feat of arms. Given the dire state of Japanese supplies, General Mutaguchi had, in his infinite wisdom, insisted that they marched as he believed that Genghis Khan's armies had marched back in the day, that is to say, with flocks of cattle and goats stolen from the local Burmese to use as walking supplies en route. However, where Genghis Khan had probably used cattle that was used to moving long distances, the Japanese in this case had stolen cattle and goats from people who didn't really have a history of moving around the place, so the animals were not used to moving very big distances, and certainly not over bloody mountains, and the result was that the columns moved incredibly slowly, as their walking food supplies either refused to move or fell down slopes or just dropped dead the whole time. The other part of the plan was for the troops to go and gather food from the local villages, but they got there and discovered to their horror that the British got there first and destroyed all the rice stocks. All the settlements between the Chindwin and the road had been visited by V-Force, that is the irregular Special Ops branch of 14th Army, and a kind of brutal discussion had taken place. Villages known or suspected of harbouring Japanese synthesizers saw the culprits handed over or their rice stocks burnt. The village would then either be given the choice to move within the British sphere of control, starve, or throw themselves on the mercy of the Japanese. All but very few moved towards India. Villagers thought to be loyal were paid over the odds for 2/3 of their rice in rupees, or issued with what amounted to IOUs for the village's long-term survival, or both. But if the Japanese were close enough, then the rice was just burnt and the people moved either way. When the Japanese arrived, they took whatever was left, but it was far less than they'd anticipated on, and it left the villages wholly dependent now on British assistance to avoid starvation. Moreover, the usual Japanese rapine attitude quickly turned potential collaborators into fervent enemies. The Japanese needed porters, so in each village they would capture the women and the children and hold them hostage, whilst the men would be forced to carry Japanese loads to the next village, whereupon, at least in theory, their loved ones would be released and new victims would be selected. More often than not, everybody was raped, tortured and killed. Murdering people's kids is not a great way to make friends, and should you ever need to come back through a village in which you've, let's say, for the sake of argument, put people into a hut and set fire to it, if you happen to be starving, wounded and bedraggled and not very well armed, life might well become rather uncomfortable and short and involve sharp knives. As the black cloud of the IJA's presence began to billow and flow over the hills, the 2,000-strong 50th Indian Parachute Brigade was enjoying what amounted to a picnic in the beautiful Naga Hills, blissfully unaware of the approaching storm. Some 35 kilometres due east of Imphal and 200 kilometres southeast of Kohima, Brigadier Hope Thompson's men were dug in on positions that they'd inherited and were beginning to prepare for a training exercise near the villages of Ukrul and Sangshak. Entirely out of the blue, on the 20th of March they were bumped, that is, they were run into, by the Japanese 58th Regiment under General Mizuyaki of the 33rd Division. Both the British and the Japanese were taken somewhat by surprise. In point of fact, 58th Regiment wasn't really supposed to be there at all. It was supposed to be somewhere else entirely, and it was off course by a number of miles. What happened next was either a pragmatic decision by the General to clear his non-existent lines of communication and thus wholly justifiably militarily, or much more probably, a decision by the General to give battle and win glory for the 33rd Division whilst cutting off 15th Division's advance, allowing him to destroy this small force of British before they could get there. The initial encounter with C Company of 152nd Indian was shocking in its brutality. In 24 hours the company was overwhelmed, with just 20 men escaping, but Mizuyaki's forces took over 450 casualties. Before C Company's positions fell, the Japanese saw one lone British officer stand up in full view of the attacking forces, fire off a few rounds from his pistol in their direction, and then put the gun against his head and blow his own brains out. This was not part of British doctrine. The Japanese were stunned. This sort of determination was not what they had expected, and they understood the message perfectly. Hope Thompson's troops had never been in combat before. He'd taken positions over not of his choosing. He was 100 miles behind the assumed Japanese advance. All he had in his favour was a lot of field artillery and 3-inch mortars and height. The 50th Brigade was trained hard and well, but no one was really sure how they were going to react. What happened next should have warned Mutaguchi, Kawabe and all the rest just how far 14th Army had come since the Arakan campaign. Cut off, completely surrounded by a vastly superior force and with no hope of relief and, because of the perimeter's shape, virtually no hope of air resupply, 50th Brigade fought ferociously, cutting their attackers to ribbons time and time again for 6 long, crucial days. Initially, Scoones simply refused to believe the reports he was getting in, but as the magnitude of what was happening to 50th Parachute Brigade began to sink in, everyone woke up to the danger to Imphal and Kohima. Meanwhile, Hope Thompson's force fought and died and stalled the Japanese, buying 14th Army time. The Brigade War Diary records that the weapon pits were a, quote, a shambles of the dead and dying, both ours and the Japanese. The men within the perimeter had been denied sleep and food and water for days, in constant fighting with their enemy, and were being killed in scores, living in a mire of decomposing flesh, with men and mules and mud mixed together in a hellish scene, and they were unable to move from their foxholes by day or by night for fear of the enemy picking them off. In desperation to take Sangshak, 15th Division pushed its entire artillery capability, dragged by elephants, up the slopes, overlooking the brigade, firing into their slit trenches directly using open sights. The pressure was just too much. Eventually, on the morning of the 26th, they faced a stark choice: to die where they stood or attempt to break out and go back to Imphal. Scoones made the decision for them. 4th Corps HQ ordered them to break out as best they could. Hope Thompson had over 450 seriously wounded men in the field dressing station, many of whom could not be moved. Those of the wounded who couldn't be moved and were still conscious were sedated to the point of insensibility with morphine. Those who could hop, limp or crawl were given a head start, and those who were unconscious were simply shot by their comrades to stop them from falling into Japanese hands. Hope Thompson ordered his guns to fire off whatever ammunition they could, providing fire that would cover off small parties as they moved through darkness back to Imphal. A handful of men who volunteered stayed behind and offered to cover the retreat and surrendered at some point that night, knowing that they would probably be killed. Extraordinarily, General Mizuyaki ordered those who surrendered, instead of being shot out of hand, to be pressed into service as porters and then stripped down to their underwear before being released near what he thought to be British lines. It was a noble gesture, but one ignored by some troops who simply shot or bayoneted the British as per normal. But, for once a Japanese commander did actually try not to commit the war crime, and it is the thought that... well, okay, I guess it isn't actually. Somehow, of the 2,000 men who'd started the fight, 900 made it back to Commonwealth lines, all but 2 carrying some kind of wound. For reasons that are wholly unclear to me, there were then recriminations. Hope Thompson was reported to have had a breakdown in the battle, something denied by his staff and disproved by his skillful handling of his troops in the defence and in the breakout, and frankly, even if he had, one might understand it. He was blamed for holding a position with no water, despite having inherited it, and never having had any expectation of a fight. He was said to have been reckless by training where he did, and yet his intelligence report said that any Japanese forces in strength were at least a week's march away. He was only expected to come across patrols, and the whole point of this was to do what Slim had asked everybody to do, which was to get small-scale actions in before moving to the front. I suspect, sadly, that Scoones needed a scapegoat for his own slow handling of the situation, and tried to blame Hope Thompson to cover his blushes. Either way, the Brigadier was never decorated for an action which almost certainly saved the entire campaign. The British had got 6 days critical warning. The Japanese were 6 days behind their schedule, with their artillery scattered all over the place, and it would take days to bring that back together again. Meanwhile, 58th Japanese Regiment had ceased to exist as a fighting force. It had been wiped out by the defenders. The entire 15th Division advance had been stopped dead for nearly a week, and 31st Division was also slowed down massively. So if you know anything about these battles, you'll know the name Kohima, and we will go through the fight there in detail next time, but for now, let's quickly pop in and see how it's doing. Oh dear. Pre-war, Kohima had been the closest thing to a central authority in the vast and largely untamed Naga Hills region. The power of the British in India had first come up against these ancient tribes in the hills of Manipur and Assam in the late 1800s, and the empire had shown its usual bizarre mix of parentalism and violence. The various peoples of the hill areas, like the Nagas and the Chins, were indigenous tribes who'd been in these hills for hundreds if not thousands of years before the Burmese or the Indians or indeed the British had ever turned up. They developed their own cultures, practices and religions, largely untouched by outside forces precisely because of their remote location. In the case of the Nagas, this was a warrior culture which, it revolved around cutting the heads off your neighbours and using them as ornaments, and frankly, whom amongst us hasn't done that occasionally? The British thought this sort of thing was not great and wanted to impose their idea of law and order, typically at bayonet point of a martini rifle. But also, they thought of the Naga tribespeople as children in need of some kind of protection from a world that was vastly more dangerous and complicated to their way of life than the British Empire was. So on the one hand, the history of the Empire and these people was filled with brutal suppression of Naga uprisings, led in at least one case by a mystic warrior woman who will become relevant in a minute, and on the other hand by a highly protective cloak that was wrapped around the Naga people. Commercial cultivation of their land was banned, as was things like barbed wire, which might stop them from migrating and using their lands as they always had, as was land acquisition and resource exploitation, as was tea planting. All of these were pushed away from the Naga areas. The deal was very roughly that if everyone behaves themselves and, for instance, stopped trying to cut the heads off their neighbours, then the British would ensure that the Nagas had room to live and breathe. Such deals were a bit tricky, as you can imagine, so a local political officer was needed with a deft touch and a quick brain, and in 1944 this was the responsibility of Deputy Commissioner Charles Pawsey. Pawsey was a veteran of the First War. He'd been decorated in the charnel house that was the Somme in 1916 and subsequently wounded on the Isonzo front in Italy, so he knew warfare at its worst and was appalled by it. He now sought only peace in this far-flung corner of the empire, and for nearly 20 years prior to the coming of the armies to these idyllic valleys and hills, Pawsey had preached the protection of the crown, adjudicated and administered justice, and had been, by all accounts, a protective and low-key brilliant representative of the empire in this region. From his beautiful bungalow set in an ornamental garden complete with a British-style tennis court, he protected the Naga tribespeople from all comers: Indian, British, American, philanthropist, missionary, archaeologist and militaries. Anyone wishing to enter the area required his permission and approval, and he gave it rarely, typically for short periods. One exception to this rule was a young lady called Ursula Graham Bower. She was bred of that totally extraordinary kind of woman who could be found in various remote corners of the empire, blending in with her environment almost perfectly. Incredibly smart, she was educated at Rodin, which you can sort of think of as being the Eton College but for girls, and then studied archaeology at Oxford at an era when that sort of thing just wasn't done. She went to India for the first time in 1937, sponsored by her father and her stepmother, who rather assumed that she'd do what a lot of girls did and either find herself a rich husband or die of malaria. She did indeed fall head over heels in love, but not with a particular boy, but rather with the Naga Hill people. She loved everything about them. In 1938 she returned, now with Pawsey's permission, to conduct a comparative study of anthropology. Suspected of being a reincarnation of a local prophetess, Ursula was adopted by both the British government and the Naga people as their representative, and she worked closely with Charles Pawsey as a fierce and determined protector. When war came in 1942, both Charles Pawsey and Ursula Graham Bower elected to remain where they were, fully aware that this would mean almost certain death if the Japanese came. With Pawsey's enthusiastic backing, when the Indian Army were looking for a local military leader, they were pointed at Ursula Graham Bower. She became in charge of something called V-Force Scouts, charged with raising an army from the Naga and Kachin people, reporting any movement that they saw, organising self-defence forces and preparing emergency evacuation points. Now, historically, the British hadn't been terribly keen on arming any of the local tribes, worrying, with some justification, that they might turn the guns on the British, or more probably on one another. But Bower was able to persuade many local warriors to take her orders, and at the same time persuade the British to hand over a number of firearms as a gesture of goodwill. And actually, on the QT, she also started to manufacture them on the side, making their own versions of various guns from bits and pieces lying around, which sounds truly terrifying to me, but there you go. Bower Force, as her troops became known, were a respected adjunct to the military efforts around Kohima, operating for months behind Japanese lines, conducting hit-and-run raids, ambushing supply columns, and merrily massacring the retreating Japanese at the end of their little mini-break in the Naga Hills. We will, in the interests of time, not really follow Ursula's adventures in a great deal of detail from here on out, but I just want you to know that if I talk about V-Force around Kohima and Imphal, that's normally Ursula's doing, and like many women in SOE in Europe who led combat teams into battle, she was never given military rank, nor a pension, nor any decorations for her extraordinary work. At the same time that the 50th Indian Parachute Regiment began their heroic action on the 20th of March 1944, Colonel Hugh Richards, commander of the 3rd West African Brigade, was contemplating another day doing damned all in Delhi. A former private, he'd come up through the ranks, been given a battlefield commission on the Western Front in 1915, and despite a brief period enjoying the hospitality of the German Kaiser following his capture in 1918, he'd stayed in the army at the end of the Great War, rising to the rank of colonel. After a stint in Africa, he and 3rd West African Brigade had been volunteered to join the Chindits, a prospect that Richards relished. However, despite completing Wingate's totally insane training programme, he then fallen foul of one of Ord's rather random pontifications, to wit, no man over 40 should be allowed to deploy. This just happened, by pure coincidence, to be the age that Wingate was at the time. Richards, then 49, had complained, as had many of his brother officers, but Wingate was immovable on this. So when the brigade flew into Burma, Richards lost them and he was posted to command a desk in Delhi whilst the army worked out what to do with him. Thus it was, when a runner arrived ordering him to report to General Gifford, Bill Slim's boss, by all haste, Richards' life went from the spectacularly dull to the far too interesting in the blink of an eye. Within 48 hours he was in the Naga Hills in the village of Kohima, inspecting what passed for their defences and growing increasingly concerned. To his trained eye, and indeed to the eye of anyone who'd visited it, Kohima was a strategic linchpin. It stuck out on the Naga Hills ahead of Dimapur like a shield and sat astride a pair of high ridgelines which dominated the Imphal road. If it fell, everything to the south, Imphal, and everything really down to the Manipur River Valley was going to be cut off from the supply place at Dimapur, and Dimapur itself would then be threatened. On the 22nd of March 1944, Kohima lay almost entirely defenceless except for a handful of troops. It had to be held. But with what? Technically, his orders said that he was in command of all forces in the Kohima area, plus the Assam Rifles. Great, but not really terribly specific. Kohima was, at that moment, a transit point for wounded, for the transport corps going up to and into Imphal, confused and small groups of reinforcements, and no fixed garrison to speak of. The only unit worth the name was the Assam Rifles, half of whom had been forward deployed to cover the approaches to Kohima from the east, and we'll meet them in a minute. What Richards actually had at his disposal was a battalion of the Royal Nepalese Army, known as the Shear Regiment, 2 companies of the Assam Rifles, 2 platoons of the Maharata Rifles, and a couple of hundred communication troops, along with some walking wounded recovering from various exciting tropical diseases. What he didn't have was mines or barbed wire or mortars or decent trench positions or heavy guns or hope of sizable reinforcements coming any time soon, nor, indeed, did he know where the Japanese were. It was, to use a phrase, a fucking balls-up of biblical proportions. Fortunately, although no one could call him a creative thinker, Richards was basically an unflappable and pragmatic soldier from the tip of his moustache to the soles of his boots. He'd never commanded Indian or Burmese troops before, he'd never fought the Japanese before, and he'd never even heard of Kohima before. But when the good Lord sees fit to give you grenades and fanatical Japanese hell-bent on killing you, then you make lemonade. Or at least you try to make the enemy's life as unpleasant and as short as possible. By the 23rd, reports of Hope Thompson's fight at Sangshak were coming through, and there was at least a division of Japanese 100 kilometres to his south, threatening Imphal, all of which sounded a little bit ominous to Richards. He did the sensible thing, cleared non-combatants out of the area, and began to prepare to defend the place as best he could with the troops that were around. In 4th Army headquarters, the assumption up to this point had been that the Japanese could really only force over the Naga Hills a regiment, that's about 3,000 men. In reality, you and I now both know that there were about 20,000 plus headed directly for Kohima, and the 1st Assam Rifles were to discover this through the medium of touch in the next couple of days. Most of 1st Assam Regiment, about 500 men under Lieutenant Colonel Bruno Brown, was deployed some 60 miles east of Kohima at the village of Jessamai. It's about a 6-hour drive away, and Richards made the journey, getting there on the 26th, to find Brown full of confidence about holding off the expected battalion of the enemy. Unlike the position at Kohima, Colonel Brown had plenty of barbed wire, plenty of mines, a pretty defensible position, some Gurkhas on hand, as well as a large number of locals that could help him out. But Brown did ask for clarification of his orders. For some reason, somebody somewhere had thought it would be a good idea to issue him with orders which said that he should hold Jessamai, which was not in any way strategic, to the last man and the last round. The battle should be fought in Kohima, and the more that Richards thought about this, it didn't really seem to make a great deal of sense to him, so he took this back up the chain. He contacted his boss, Brigadier Daddy Warren of 161 Brigade, and Warren agreed with Richards that this sounded completely dumb, so he spoke to his boss, the area commander, General Ranking, on the 28th of March, and all of them agreed that they should rescind the order. But then, suddenly, 1st Assam Rifles disappeared off the radio net. Out in the hills, Lieutenant Colonel Brown had placed a small detachment of 120 men roughly 9 miles to his south under Captain John Young of the A Company at a village called Karasom. On the 27th of March, they saw a strong enemy force to their front, moving artillery and ammunition and troops, probably towards Imphal. Young knew that he was ridiculously outnumbered, but he also knew that he had his orders, and he opened fire immediately. He was in fact engaging 138th Regiment of the 31st Division trying to make their way to Kohima, but again, miles off course, and once battle was joined, elements of other regiments joined in too. For the second time, the Japanese army's supposedly lightning movement against the British lines was getting bogged down in a stupid fight, using overwhelming numbers to capture an objective that didn't matter one jot in the grand scheme of things to the campaign. With his radio shot up and out of action and most of his company wounded or dead, after 2 days Young felt that his duty had been done, but at the same time he needed to make sure that his men could get out. He ordered them to make their way back to the main body while he held the position and gave them covering fire. He and a wounded sepoy were last seen stacking Tommy gun clips and grenades by their position. 90 men in all made it to the Kohima perimeter alive. It was claimed later that the Japanese had taken Young's body, shaved his head in the manner of a respected warrior, and buried him with full military honours. More probably they had burnt it like they burnt their own dead. Meanwhile, Bruno Brown's men at Jessamai were also fully engaged, now by 5 battalions of the 31st Division advancing towards Kohima. The imbalance of forces here is just nuts. Sato himself realised that he had a major problem. He had nearly 10,000 men engaged or milling around the area, trying to take on perhaps 400 men inside the Jessamai perimeter. The 31st Division timetable did not allow for this kind of delay, but Japanese honour demanded that battle, when offered, must be joined. Frustrated beyond imagination by the delays, Sato came forward in person to reprimand his troops, but it was too late. They were all engaged, and all he could do was to watch the final assaults go in. Unsure exactly what was going on, Richards had tried to send out a series of runners from Kohima, almost all of whom were killed, but one did manage to get through to Bruno Brown's headquarters and ordered them and the remaining men in the pocket to withdraw at 0300 hours on the morning of the 28th of March. To try and make sure that Brown got hold of these orders, Richard had ordered transport planes to drop them by parachute when they were providing supplies, but because the size of Bruno Brown's position was so small, they fell directly into Japanese hands. So now Bruno knew that the enemy knew what his orders were, and he was forced to delay the breakout by 24 hours. During that time, the Japanese put in a series of massed attacks to try and swamp his position and prevent his escape. By the skin of their teeth, Brown and his surviving troops were able to break out in parties, some 260 of the original 400 eventually getting back to Kohima in the next couple of days, and a further 50 or so eventually polling up at Imphal after a nightmare cross-country journey. Everything we've talked about so far in this story has been concentrated in a pretty short space of time. From the very first crossing of the Chindwin in the south by Yanagida's forces to the battles of Jessamai, Sangshak and Karasom was less than 3 weeks. The desperate fighting by the 17th and 20th Divisions as they extracted themselves back up to Imphal took effectively 10 days, and for all this time it was desperately unclear to Slim, and indeed to the rest of 14th Army commanders, exactly where the main attack was headed. Logically, it would either be Imphal, where 4th Corps HQ was, or it would be the supply dumps of Dimapur. Of the two, Dimapur was the most strategically important, and therefore the place that Slim felt he needed to defend first. What was clear either way was that Slim might be deep in the shit. Tiddim and Tamu had been abandoned as per Slim's original plan, but late thanks to Schoon's dithering, leaving both reliant on support from 23rd Division, which had sucked troops southward away from Sato's strike force, a force which was clearly many times stronger than had been anticipated. Dimapur had basically been left undefended. Slim was effectively facing a far stronger enemy force than planned, with a far weaker British force than planned in a different sector than planned. Or to put it another way, a good old-fashioned British military disaster was in the offing. In response, Slim needed to get a lot of troops from across India to his front right fucking now, and he had some contingencies in mind. First of all, he played a little bit of musical chairs. He broke off 5th and 7th Divisions from Christison and the Arakan, combined them with 2nd British Division and created something called 33rd Corps, appointing Lieutenant General Montague Stopford to command. The idea here was to bring a powerful formation in to beat the Japanese in Assam. The problem was that all this was lovely on paper, but absolutely none of those units were where they needed to be. 5th and 7th were still in the Arakan, and 2nd British were in sodding Bombay. Bombay, which is not terribly close to Assam, and by not terribly close, I mean like it's the same distance as LA to Kansas City, only with no highways, or London to St. Petersburg. Slim needed to get them all into Assam yesterday, so he went to go and see his boss, 11th Army Group Commander and all-round wet blanket, Gifford. Slim got on well with Gifford, provided Gifford did what Slim wanted him to do, basically get out of the way and let Slim get on with the job at hand. But when he needed help at this critical juncture, Gifford demurred, muttering something about transport and the ability to supply huge numbers of troops in Assam, given the shockingly bad roads and the lack of rations, and how the Americans were rather difficult allies and shouldn't be disturbed now that Stilwell was finally actually doing something potentially useful. In normal circumstances, this might have sounded reasonable, but now with 50,000 Japanese troops headed to gods alone knew where, and with another 30,000 or so pushing in from the south, it was frankly bloody stupid. In defeat to victory, Slim is as nice as pie about Gifford, merely commenting that this wasn't the response that he was hoping for, but one slightly detects a hint of Gifford having had enough of this overmighty subordinate and stuck his oar in just for the sake of sticking his oar in. He refused permission to move all of 2nd Division to Assam, and he didn't even try and get more aircraft to move 5th and 7th Divisions. It was incredibly petty. Fortunately, Mountbatten happened to visit Slim for a conference on the situation, and I can't prove it, but I suspect either Dickie was a lot brighter than he looked and worked out for himself that there was a problem here, or someone in Slim's staff suggested now would be a good moment for a chat. Either way, the two met, there was a conversation, and Mountbatten swung into action as only the truly entitled can. He ordered the US Troop Carrier Command aircraft operating the Hump airlift to stop whatever they were doing and come to the aid of the British PD-damned Q. Now, the issue here was that the Hump aircraft were the holy cows of Roosevelt's China First policy. Orders effectively signed in triplicate and using small words in big letters on official-looking paper informed all and sundry that limey toff Mountbatten was under no circumstances to touch America's planes. Fortunately, Dickie didn't understand the word no, having never come across it before. There then followed a series of tragic and desperately unfortunate events which thwarted Washington's best intentions. Firstly, Mountbatten issued orders that he wasn't authorised to issue. Then Bill Olds, commander of Troop Transport Command, developed severe short-term amnesia and forgot that he wasn't allowed to take orders from the British on Hump aircraft. And then the absolute legends of the United States Army Air Force collectively lost the ability to read maps properly and mistook the Arakan for China. Repeatedly for several weeks. All Washington could do on discovering its aircraft were involved in the airlift of 2 entire divisions was to smile and pretend it had been their idea all along. And so it was, one of the largest airborne operations of the war, Operation Stamina, got off the ground. A couple of quick asides here before we continue. Firstly, Gifford's failure to act decisively broke the relationship between the SEAC Supreme Commander and the 11th Army Group Commander. One of his own staff wrote to Mountbatten saying that Gifford had shown absolutely no initiative or drive whatsoever, and confirmed what Mountbatten had always thought, that Gifford was a wet lettuce who needed to be got rid of. In May, Mountbatten fired him, but this being Mountbatten, he hadn't really thought the damn thing through, and what happened next led to 2 very suboptimal outcomes. The first of those was yet another idiot, Lieutenant General Oliver Leese, who would be taking over, but at the minute he was busy making a pig's ear of things on the Gothic Line in Italy, so he couldn't actually arrive till October. So the second suboptimal outcome was that Gifford would now have to sit in the job which he'd been fired from, effectively without authority, for 5 months. The second aside I want to make is regarding Bill Olds and really the USAAF generally. I quite want a statue of him and his men on my front lawn. During Stamina, he literally got anything with wings into the air and sent it south to go and help the RAF and the 14th Army, and he really didn't need to. He could have, as I suspect Stilwell's staff would have liked, followed orders from Washington and just simply refused to help. Instead, he risked his career, not to mention his life, to help the British out, and he was far from alone. I've been very rude about certain Americans, specifically Joe Stilwell and the idiots that he surrounded himself with, constantly waving their dicks around whilst accusing their various allies of every failing under the sun, even as they themselves butchered their own troops and achieved nothing of note. But nothing could be in sharper contrast to that than the behaviour of the magnificent men of the United States Army Air Force. From the kids flying LA-5s into tiny jungle clearings to get casualties out, to the boys operating C-46s and 47s from rough strips across India to help support British operations, to the guys flying long-range heavy bomber missions with clapped-out B-17s and 24s that no one else wanted. I doff my cap to their courage and determination, doing a very, very unglamorous job that was unquestionably the backbone of victory in Burma. They mucked in and combined with the RAF almost seamlessly and were proper fucking allies in a proper fucking fight. Sorry, where were we? Ah yes, Slim about to do Slim things. It is generally considered a very bad idea to try and move large bodies of men around on the fly. Famously, for example, Kaiser Wilhelm found himself at the beginning of World War I unable to stop the trains in 1914 because years of planning by General Staff had never really considered the possibility that a head of state might change his mind mid-mobilisation. The French had, at least in part, failed in June 1940 because their tanks and troops were all in the wrong bloody places. And in 1944, Slim was facing the same problem. His troops weren't where they were needed. But with the aircraft to move them and a highly competent staff, as well as the motivation of having the Mobile War Crimes Unit that was the IJA bearing down on them, they got to work. Over the first 11 days of Operation Stamina, 15,000 men of 5th Division, their mules, their guns, their stores, their jeeps and everything else that they needed to fight, were picked up and lifted from the Arakan front to the central Assam front, with 748 sorties landing in Imphal. This was pure grunt by the combined air forces. It also meant that they would need a further 500 tons of stores daily to keep going, something that the USAAF and the RAF were able to supply. Fortunately, 2nd Division was also on the move. Just prior to this flap breaking out, there'd been a decision to try and move them to Chittagong, so 10,000 men, along with all of their kit, supplies, guns, transport, ammunition, radios, and everything that they might need for a 7-day battle, was being shifted by train just over 1,700 miles from Bombay to Chittagong. The plan was from there to embus and go down to the Arakan front. A move like this could have, and probably should have, taken months. Slim's staff managed it in just over a week. The problem was, by the time they got there, everybody had realised that they needed 33rd Corps in Assam, and so now, after a stand-up row with Gifford, Slim finally got permission to move them, and on the 27th of March, 4 days after the Japanese first elements showed up all along the northern front, they were sent north. The swearing in the staff planning rooms, on the train carriages at Chittagong Station, and amongst the railway workers hardly bears thinking about. It was some 800 miles by rail and road from Chittagong to Dimapur, and even on a good day, a single person doing that now might take 24 hours of constant travelling. With no aircraft left available to lift them, they'd have to do it the old-fashioned way. Nevertheless, they managed the shift in direction remarkably quickly, but the question was, would it be quick enough? We will find out the answer to that next time on Imphal 44.